Erev Tov, everybody. We are starting Chumash Vayikra, and after journeying through a year or two, and then Bereshit with Rav Meidan and Shemot with Dr. Aviva Zornberg, we are accompanied for Vayikra by Rabbi Dr. Shai Held. I have had his 2-volume work of essays on the weekly Parashah, the Heart of Torah, on my shelf for a long time. In the year or two when he was putting out some of these Divrei Torah as weekly essays through Hadar, I read many of them and found them wonderful. So Vayikra is often the most challenging of the books, and or at least of the 4 that we do together over the year. We're often not together for Devarim in the summertime. And so I thought it would be great to get a chance to experience it through the lens of his writing and thinking. And so we'll start off with a little excerpt from the end of the introduction, and then go right into Vayikra number 1. There's 2 essays on each parasha, so I'll be choosing one of the 2. And I think they should be about a good length to be able to get through in our time together. So I'm going to share my screen just to look at a quick zoom through the introduction. The introduction really lays out a kind of how Rav Shai thinks about the Torah and the theology and philosophy that it puts forth. So just even looking at the topic sentences, biblical texts tell a story about a God who loves, and he has a one example that I never thought about before for this priority of love over commandment, from the idea that what's placed in the Aron Kodesh even before the 10 Commandments is the man. And I love this quote. Scripture first tells us about a God of manna before it tells us about a God of mandates. And he has a number of other examples and frameworks for thinking about God's love, that love being about a commitment to life there. I think we see very strongly the influence of one of his primary teachers, Rabbi Yitzchak Greenberg, really talks about Judaism's theology and the message of the Torah as a message of life. Obviously, we know that Rav Shai was deeply influenced by the writing and thinking of Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel. It was the subject of his dissertation and his book. So we hear those overtones as well. So then the shift from, if Jewish theology is grounded in God's love, it's equally focused on human responsibility. Going free from Egypt, becoming a nation is all about entering into that relationship of responsibility. There was a spot, I might not get it as we go through, where he even references kind of the God who protects the needy and vulnerable, which links to what we saw with Dr. Aviva Zornberg a couple weeks ago, of the makom sha'at motzei gevurato shamat motzei an v'tanuto, that God's might and power is depicted most with God's humility, or being with the lowly or vulnerable or needy. And then the sense of God's continued demand for our living up to that mission, to embrace the covenant between God and Israel, is to be summoned to embody the good and the holy, and the kind of widespread implications and applications of that. The essence of Torah is a God of love and kindness who calls Israel to love and kindness. Obviously, we can think about things that feel like counterexamples to that, and so that's why it's worth reading the whole introduction and journeying through the essays together. Obviously, we encounter a zealous God, a vengeful God, and so we have to think about how that fits in this framework. Judaism dreams of a world in which human dignity is real and the presence of God is manifest, and yet the world as we know it all too often makes a mockery of that dream. So how do we kind of move forward in light of that? And he talks about Shabbat, he talks about the Mishkan, which we're going to see in this week's essay, as sort of frameworks. And And now, I think we'll go through from here. In writing these essays, I have not shied away from admitting when texts seem morally or theologically disturbing. Thus, for example, I ask how the Torah, which usually challenges us to overcome our fears and visit the sick, can stigmatize the Mitzorah and bar him from the camp. I consider the distressing possibility that from a modern perspective, at least, the Torah might sanction marital rape of a captive bride. And I probe the question of how the Torah can extend beyond abhorring Amalek's inhumanity to condemning all Amalekites, present and future, as eternal enemies of God. I cannot offer easy answers where none are available. My concern is less with defending the Torah than with understanding it and wrestling with it. But in every instance, I have chosen to read as humanely as possible. And he talks about this idea of humanism. My own readings reflect my belief in a God who prioritizes the ethical, and by rabbinic tradition's own claim that love of neighbor and affirmation of every human being as an image of God are the great principles of the Torah. In a similar vein, I've tried to read the stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs honestly, explaining his decision to quote liberally from both traditional rabbinic sources and Greek and Arabic philosophers. Maimonides establishes one of the pillars of his approach to life and learning: accept the truth from wherever it comes. Accordingly, in attempting to understand and interpret biblical texts, I have cast a very wide net, appealing to Talmudic sages and medieval commentators, and also to modern academic scholars, both Jewish and Christian. And I would say here is where I encountered the most unfamiliar names in modern Christian commentators. Wonderful world to open up through Rav Shai's explications. I found it enormously fruitful to have Rashi talk to Patrick Miller, Ibn Ezra to Terence Fretheim, and Rabbi Akiva to Jacob Milgram. I do not pursue eclecticism for its own sake, but time and again, I have found that by examining a wide range of commentaries from a broad array of contexts, I understand texts better and more clearly. So too, and here we have a little bit of Dr. Aviva Zornberg in the background, maybe Rav Meidan to a degree as well. I bring together literary, psychological, and philosophical theological approaches to Torah. I focus not just on what texts say, but also on how they say it, and in particular on how biblical texts talk to one another. I attempt to understand how texts address the complexity and intractability of the human spirit. And I ask always what the text intends to say about God, and by extension, what it means to live life in service of that God. This book of collected essays is called The Heart of Torah. My hope is to get at the very heart of the Torah's vision of God, Israel, and humanity, and to make the point sadly neglected in many popular presentations of Judaism that Rachamana liba bai, God the Merciful One desires the heart. Jews have been reading and rereading the Torah for thousands of years. I regard it as an immense privilege to be able to read the same texts as countless generations before me have read, and to contribute a link, however small, to a sacred chain of interpretation. I pray that my readers will find in these essays ideas to challenge and inspire them, spiritual sustenance to nourish them, and provocations to unsettle them. May the words of my mouth and the integrity of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So that's the introduction or excerpts therefrom. And we're going to go right into Vayikra. We'll have some good pausing points as we go. The essay here sort of breaks into two parts: a framework of understanding Bereshit, and then the application of that to Vayikra. So this is Vayikra number 1, order amid chaos, connecting to Leviticus. Around this time each year, the eyes of many shul-going Jews begin to glaze over. Leviticus seems so utterly foreign, the rituals and practices it describes so alien, the religious vision underlying them so obscure, that connecting to it seems impossible. Right? Actually, I think the fact that he kind of details a few points here, I think is significant, right? The rituals and practices are alien, and the religious vision underlying them is obscure. Right? I think about, the details of korbanot, but also what's the ultimate message of korbanot. At some deepest level, we relate to the idea of closeness to God, but maybe at that intermediate level, animal sacrifice as a means of drawing close, that religious vision is less accessible to us perhaps today. Yet if we dig a little deeper, we find a great deal about Leviticus that can speak powerfully to modern sensibilities and yearnings. Ask a traditionally educated Jew, and he or she is likely to tell you that before God began to create the world, there was simply nothing. The Jewish view, he or she will insist, is that God created the world out of nothing, ex nihilo. Many philosophers object that the idea of ex nihilo is actually incoherent, since after all, something cannot be made out of nothing. In their words, out of nothing, nothing comes. Ex nihilo nihil fit. The idea that God created something out of nothing is, at any rate, a far cry from the ways in which creation is portrayed in Tanakh, right? So first step is to say, this is philosophically challenging. Second step is to say, okay, that's not an irrefutable or insurmountable argument, because God can do things that are philosophically challenging. But more to the point, it's not clear that the Torah actually says that something was created out of nothing. Biblical texts describe a God who creates the world by bringing order where before there was only chaos. As Genesis 1 portrays it, God takes an earth that is unformed and void, and makes a cosmos, a place where life can survive and flourish out of it. Bible scholar John Levinson writes that 2.5 millennia of Western theology have made it easy to forget that throughout the ancient Near Eastern world, including Israel, creation is not the production of matter out of nothing, but rather the emergence of a stable community in a benevolent and life-sustaining order. Okay, so somehow our Western theology has skewed our view of what the Bible in its ancient Near Eastern context might really have been saying, which was there was something, but it was wild and uncontrolled, and the actions of God were to create order out of it. Genesis 1 presents God's rule as majestic and uncontested. But read Genesis 1 alone, assume that it represents the biblical approach to creation rather than merely one of them, and you will miss something crucial about biblical theology as a whole. Many biblical texts explicitly invoke a God who created the world by engaging in combat with dangerous and threatening forces of chaos, meaning in Bereshit Aleph, God may be making order out of something that was formless and void, but pretty much the whole chapter is just God presented as in complete and absolute control, taking one step at a time to make even more order. But other texts in the Tanakh give us this sense that actually this was a complex battle and a continual pushback against this chaos. Some assume more dramatically that this process of subduing chaos is far from over. Much of the ancient world, water and the sea embody and symbolize chaos, threat, and a world not yet under control. Picture the devastation wrought by recent tsunamis and hurricanes, and you can begin to understand just how and why this is the case. Psalm 74 evokes a great cosmic battle between God and the monstrous forces of chaos. By the way, Rav Shai has taught on a number of occasions Sefer Tehillim, and I think really sees there's more than meets the eye often. There's more than just saying Tehillim to the book of Tehillim. The psalmist praises God for vanquishing the forces of cosmic evil. It is you who drove back the sea with your might, who smashed the heads of the monsters in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan. Chaos defeated, God proceeds to order and structure the universe. It was you who set in place the orb of the sun. You fixed all the boundaries of the earth, summer and winter. You made them, right? And so it's that second set of verses, which is what Bereshit Aleph represents. But what Rav Shai is introducing to us is if you read Tehillim 74, you see that there's a backstory, a pre-story that has all this battle against these other forces in order to create the stability into which the creation story happens. And yet, crucially, even in a psalm that describes God's great victory over the forces of evil, the defeated forces of chaos still rear their ugly head and threaten to reverse God's good ordering of the world. The sea monsters may be defeated, but human forces acting destructively in history still wreak havoc with God's plans, leaving the psalmist at once pained and perplexed. Right before the verses we have just seen, the psalmist asks, "Till when, O God, will the foe blaspheme? Will the enemy forever revile your name? Why do you hold back your hand, your right hand? Draw it out of your bosom." And right after, he implores, "Do not ignore the shouts of your foes, the din of your adversaries that ascends all the time." So the kind of framework around this creation story gives the sense that those dark forces are still at battle. Leviathan may be dead, but all is still not right with the world. As Levinson poignantly notes, Psalm 74 honestly and courageously draws attention to the painful and yawning gap between the liturgical affirmation of God's absolute sovereignty and the empirical reality of evil, triumphant and unchecked. Going a little further, some biblical texts are much more radical than Psalm 74. They imagine a world in which the forces of chaos were not vanquished in the past. God's victory will take place only in an apocalyptic future. The prophet Isaiah looks forward to the day when the Lord will punish with God's great, cruel, mighty sword, Leviathan, the elusive serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent. God will slay the dragon, Tanin, in the sea. In Isaiah's world, God is not yet fully Lord over all creation. There are forces afoot, dangerous, unpredictable, deadly forces. God will one day slay them, but they have not yet been defeated. In a similar vein, a Talmudic sage imagines a future in which God will make a banquet for the righteous, during which they will eat the body of the slain sea monster. This is from Talmud Bavli, Baba Batra 75a. We must not forget, Levinson writes, that the optimistic element in this theology, which is the faith in God's ultimate triumph, is dialectically qualified by the pessimistic element, which is tacit acknowledgement that God is not yet God, meaning that vision of the future tells us that it's as yet unrealized. The fully triumphant and in control God triumphing over evil hasn't been realized yet. What contemporary sense can we make of such starkly mythological imagery? Are these texts not destined to seem hopelessly antiquated to contemporary readers? Here's, I think, the crux. It depends, I think, on how literally we want to take talk of sea monsters. The fact is that we live in a world that often seems chaotic in ways large and small, and that there is something wholly terrifying about this. On some level, all of us know that we, or the worst thought imaginable, our children, could be hurt or harmed or killed in an instant, in a freak accident, or at the hands of a crazed sociopath or a cruel monster. The fact that we still use the language of monsters to describe people totally indifferent to moral norms and constraints is surely telling. Most of us still do believe in and fear monsters of one kind or another. What makes parts of Tanakh so powerful, so compelling, and so utterly contemporary is precisely the fact that they do not paper over the reality that life can be so totally frightening and seemingly so random and chaotic. Biblical texts give voice to the pain of affirming the reality of a powerful God on the one hand, while acknowledging the often excruciating ways that the world we believe God envisions and wants is unbearably far from being realized on the other. Tanakh gives voice to the agony often felt by those who believe in the reality of a good, life-affirming creator, but who must nevertheless live in a seemingly endless period of not yet. Divine dreams and human yearnings, all subjected to a protracted and painful period of not yet. Okay, we're on the cusp of what does all this have to do with Leviticus, but I just pause for a minute. If anybody wants to react or comment just to this sort of part one, the idea of the creation story as not actually necessarily something from nothing, but really something from something, and that something is all about making order, and the idea that even Genesis 1 is a mild version of the story, and to varying degrees we have biblical and rabbinic texts that give a sense that is a kind of ongoing battle that God is still waging, and therefore the recognition that makes room for that the vision of an ordered world is still not yet achieved. Lance, go ahead.
Isaiah 45:7 says that God creates both all the good and all good and all evil. What I think you're talking about here when you talk about chaos or evil or so forth is dualism and not monotheism. Monotheism means that there is only one entity, force, whatever you want to call it, and anything in terms of good and evil, God versus Satan, is basically a dualism. Now, Judaism has, I think, to a great extent, that dualistic concept. Certainly Christianity and Islam and most of the other religions, or maybe all the other religions, are dualistic, okay? And the problem that I have here is that there are prophets like Nahum, for example, who see a God that is really a crazed sociopath.
Yeah.
And Job, I think, is the same thing. But most people, who really wants that kind of God? We all want the kind of God that you've just heard about, which is good and loving and so forth. To me, that's Christian.
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting point you're raising, which is, as I'm kind of translating it, how does Rav Shai therefore understand these theological approaches of a God who's still wrestling with chaos and darkness? What does that mean about limitations on God's omnipotence, and therefore on the sense that there are other powers in the world? This is, I think, a really good, important question, which he doesn't fully address here. So thank you. Any other comments before we bridge to Leviticus? Yeah, Nathan, go ahead. Unmute when you can.
So I want to respond to something that Lance said, because I thought of this when we were reading the introduction, that the Christians normally say that the Old Testament God is a God of jealousy, a God of punishment, and a God of anger, and the New Testament God is the God of love. So Rav Shai was saying, well, the God of the Old Testament is also a God of love.
Yes.
In fact, primarily a God of love. So Lance says, well, that's Christian, and I think Rav Shai is very much aware of that, that he's flipping the script.
Yes. Yes.
So he's got to answer questions, and he admits he has to answer questions. I don't think he wants to give the Christians that ground. He wants to win that back.
Yes. Yes.
I probably gave the impression that I'm anti-Christian, and that's really not true. On the other side of the coin, I don't think you can sum up the New Testament God in any easy way. In fact, the New Testament is really a kind of horrible conflict, as if you had all the rabbis of the Talmud talking to each other. And it's in the New Testament, the same thing. In fact, my personal belief is that the Talmud is a rewriting of the New Testament, and it's infinitely better. The New Testament is a hovel, and the Talmud is a Taj Mahal. So, I appreciate what you're saying, and I think we're in very difficult waters here. It's an extremely complex situation.
Yes.
And I'm afraid that I fall into these prejudices myself, and it's very difficult to think of this. I would suggest that the world is so complex that there is no way of ever finding any absolute correct answer to anything.
Fair. I tend to incline in that kind of direction also. All right.
And by the way, that's Charles W. Kingsfield Jr. in The Paper Chase.
Awesome.
His philosophy, and I love it.
Awesome. All right, here we go. What does all this have to do with the Leviticus? An awful lot, I think. Let's return to Genesis 1 for a moment. How does God bring about a habitable world? By dividing, separating, and ordering, and then bringing forth life. God separates Vayavdel, light from darkness. God separates the waters above the firmament from the waters below it. God distinguishes sea from dry land. God places lights in the firmament to separate day from night and light from darkness. God distinguishes Shabbat from other days and declares it holy, Vayikra. Genesis 1 and Leviticus are closely intertwined, since the project of dividing and separating is at least as crucial to the latter, that is Leviticus, as it is to the former, Genesis 1. As Robert Alter writes, there is a single verb that focuses the major themes of Leviticus. Divide, hivdil, what I have been rendering following the New Jewish Publication Society translation as separate. Thus, for example, the catalog of animals permitted or forbidden for eating ends with the following. These are the instructions, Zot HaTorah, concerning animals, birds, all living creatures that swarm on earth, to separate, lahavdil, between the impure and the pure, between the living things that may be eaten and the living things that may not be eaten. That's the end of Vayikra Yod Aleph. Again, after presenting a list of forbidden sexual unions, Leviticus notes, I am the Lord your God who has separated, hivdalti, you from other peoples. So shall you separate, v'hivdaltem, the pure beast from the impure bird from the pure. You shall not draw abomination upon yourselves through beast or bird, or anything with which the ground is alive, which I have separated for you, hivdalti, to treat as impure, chapter 20. So this first point here is to say that if Bereshit is largely accomplished by various ways of dividing and separating, primarily lahavdil, that's a central theme in Vayikra also. In fact, we don't see it, the word doesn't actually appear that much, but it appears in the summary statements at the end of significant sections. And so that's Robert Alter's point, a verb that focuses the major themes. Again, it's not, you don't find it sprinkled throughout as much, but it's there at the kind of coda of each major section, or of many of the major sections. There seems to be an element of walking in God's ways here. Just as God has separated and ordered to create the world, so Israel must engage in separation and ordering. By dividing sharply between permitted foods and forbidden ones, and between permitted sexual unions and forbidden ones, Israel engages in something godly. But Israel does not merely imitate God by separating and ordering. Through its ritual life, it participates in ordering the world, and thus in sustaining it. The consequence of all this separation is spelled out in the very next verse. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and I have separated you, va'avdil etchem, from other peoples to be mine. Israel, a people separated, affirms its special status by committing to acts of separating and ordering. Right? So God separates and orders to create the world. God separates the Jewish people and charges them with the mission of separating and ordering in our own religious lives. The tabernacle, the Mishkan, is nothing if not a tightly structured, highly ordered space. Who may enter where, at what time, and in what garb, all is tightly regulated. The profane must never spill over into, and thus violate, the sacred. The sacrifices are carefully choreographed and presented just right. In a chaotic, terrifying world, one place at least is governed by order and structure. I'll have to say, as an aside, I think when I read this, I think about the fact that, there is a certain terror to the order and the structure in how rigid it is, right? We've spoken about that many times around the death of Nadav and Avihu, for example, the idea that good intention and desire to participate in the service leading one just a drop askew of the order has disastrous consequences. So there's something here that, just to my ear, like the comfort of the structure also comes with a tremendous severity to the structure, which I don't feel like gets enough kind of credit here. In a chaotic, terrifying world, one place at least is governed by order and structure. Bible scholar Richard Nelson explains that in Leviticus, sacred space was seen as an island of structure and order surrounded by malevolent chaos. Sacred space provided the human mind with a fixed center, the solace of formed order in the midst of formless chaos. And then you have we all have the footnotes here in the end of the file for anybody who wants to follow up on these. It's perhaps tempting for many of us to adopt a condescending approach to all this preoccupation with order. And this section, by the way, really resonated with me just as like next order thought. about this argument. We may imagine that we have moved beyond the kind of anxiety that seems at least partly to underlie Leviticus's manifold legislation, and congratulate ourselves for our willingness to embrace life's messiness. To be sure, there's something important, humanly and religiously, in our ability to tolerate and even embrace messiness. And yet the reality of chaos and the experience of seemingly total randomness are always with us, and the fear they induce is real, as is for many of us the theological questioning and struggle they call forth. I think that's an important point. We recognize life is complicated, it's messy, etc., but Rav Shai is sort of inviting us into the basic instinct and need that we have for order and the fear that we have of the uncontrolled chaos of the world around us, and to give a listen for that sense in ourselves, and wants to make the case that the order of Vayikra that the Torah is presenting is meant to provide a container to hold us in that fear. Leviticus presents another alternate reality to inhabit. Worship in the Mishkan is intended as a counter-world to Israel's lived experience, which is dangerous and disordered. The counter-world offered in the tabernacle holds out the gift of a well-ordered, joy-filled, and peace-generating creation. Bible scholar Samuel Ballantine captures beautifully the point I am trying to make. Who among us does not yearn for that one place, however small and difficult to find, that invites us to believe the very good world God created and the world in which we scratch out our frail existence are in fact one and the same? Leviticus attempts to describe and thus to evoke that place. In reading and studying Leviticus, we are invited to imagine and inhabit just such a space, if only for a brief moment. Right. So, I mean, we're almost at the end here, and I guess I'll say, I think what Rav Shai wants us to do. Obviously, this is not a close reading of any section of Chumash of Parashat Vayikra, or just a really overarching view of Sefer Vayikra. And I was even thinking about the fact that Vayikra has multiple parts to it, and the section which scholars often call the Holiness Code, sort of centered around Parashat Kedoshim, actually feels very disorderly in terms of its kind of wide array of mitzvot of all kinds that feel kind of thrown together. And I think, an actual order to those mitzvot has eluded commentaries. So it's interesting to think about how much this holds true across the whole book. But for sure, Parashiot Vayikra and Tzav, to a degree Shmini, Tazria Mitzora, Emor to a significant degree, and Bahar Bechukotai, like the very, very bulk of the book, has these very clearly ordered sections. Even thinking about Parshat Vayikra, I can close my eyes and picture the inside of my tikkun when I've practiced the Torah reading for this parsha, which kind of has a very unusual thing where it takes whole sections and puts like an aleph next to them and a bet and a gimel, because there are whole sections about the korbanot which are just repeated with only slight variations. Here it is with this kind of animal. Here it is with this kind of animal. So there really is a highly ordered structure to a lot of parts of Vayikra. And I think what Rav Shai is sort of saying to us is there's a reading strategy here, which is, as our eyes are tempted to glaze over, to just get into the experience of the structure. And, what does it feel like to imagine a religious place and ritual that is so ordered? And what's that, what is that, what comfort does that give us, and what way does that sort of hold us, and what is it kind of pushing back against or responding to? What happens to a person who has visited the Mishkan, and by extension into our own time, who has imaginatively entered the Mishkan through close study of Leviticus? Here I also want to say, when I read this halfway into the sentence, and by extension into our own time, I ended the sentence, who has entered into our Mishkan or Mikdash Ma'at, our synagogue, and sort of asked the question, to what extent should a shul model highly ordered structure and a familiar, replicable service, order, infrastructure that helps people feel like they have an oasis from the unpredictable chaos of life, and or to what extent does it also need to be something different from that? So that was sort of a different direction I went in thinking about the application of the structures of Vayikra to our lives, but that's not Rav Shai's direction for now. One who has imaginatively entered the Mishkan through close study of Leviticus. Having partaken of or merely glimpsed the counter world that the Mishkan represents, a person is changed, at least when the practice works. After the glimpse he or she has been afforded, nothing looks quite the same anymore. He or she sees that another reality is possible, that the chaos and suffering he or she observes all around are not ultimately all there is. As the anthropologist Clifford Geertz wonderfully puts it, having ritually leapt into the framework of meaning which religious conceptions define, and the ritual ended, returned again to the common sense world, a man is, unless as sometimes happens the experience fails to register, changed. And as he is changed, so also is the common sense world, for it is now seen as but the partial form of a wider reality which corrects and completes it. To read Leviticus then is to enter a different kind of world, a small pocket of reality in which God's will is heeded and perfectly executed, in which chaos and disorder are kept at bay, in which thus God is already fully God, even as the realities outside fall painfully short of that long longed for dream. Of course, I also have in the back of my mind, the relationship between the way in which the system is presented in the words of Vayikra and what Rav Avi has taken to saying to me recently from time to time. The Beit HaMikdash was a slaughterhouse. There was blood flowing on the floor, right? So there's sort of like the image of the ordered structure of the service of the sacrifices, and then there's the different kind of messiness of what that actual place must have looked like, right? We are accustomed, if we see pictures of the Beit HaMikdash not really in use. We see the pictures of the physical structure and the pristine, vessels, but it was messy. It was very messy. So I think there's that other dimension also that has to be sort of thought about in relationship to this. So this is Rav Shai. It takes a little less time than some of our other forays. I'm happy to hear any initial thoughts or reactions before we wrap up. James, go for it.
Not very satisfactory. It seems he's presenting the Mishkan as this manufactured, artificial world that humans have constructed within the natural world that God has constructed, that's ordered and disordered and messy. It seems like God is the one that's in charge of the chaos and order, and then humans have to go and make a ordered building and ritual to make sense of their own lives. It doesn't really match to what the overarching theme he's trying to present.
So let's stay on it for a minute, because I may not be understanding you. I understood him to say God's work as creator is to create a world which is increasingly ordered amidst the chaos, and to varying degrees that has and hasn't succeeded depending on which texts you read, but that's sort of God's mission, and that involves divisions and creating order, and because it has not, taking the reading that of the more radical readings, as he called them, it hasn't fully succeeded. So we are emulating God in trying to create a world inside that world, which models the world God hasn't yet fully succeeded in creating, the order.
To escape God's world.
Well, I mean, if we take that last quote by Clifford Geertz, it's to be strengthened to see that we can make further headway in the process of creating order. And then when we leave it and come back to the still chaotic world, we are empowered to keep making order inside that chaotic world.
I guess it's difficult because the disorder that's in God's world is not one of time or things not happening on a schedule or pattern. It's the chaos of violence and malice and destruction and entropy, and making a mikdash doesn't help that at all. It just pulls us away from it into like a, a manufactured utopia, maybe.
Right. So let me share the screen again, just because I'm not overly looking to defend Rav Shai, but just to make sure we're reading it. We're reading it, and then we can take it as satisfying or unsatisfying. Right. I think this last bit, after the glimpse he or she has been afforded, nothing looks quite the same anymore. He or she sees that another reality is possible, that the chaos and suffering he or she observes all around are not ultimately all there is. Right. So I still take that as, the goal of reading Vayikra and or setting foot into the Mishkan is to say we can get closer to there, and when we then come out into our still chaotic world, we are that escape is meant to give us more hope, strength to continue the work in the real world, which is still chaotic, but we are enjoined to make more order out of. That's still.
I'm going to hang in for a couple more weeks, but he hasn't convinced me at all.
Great. Fair enough. David?
I want to join James. I think that what Rav Shai is talking about, or what the Mishkan, the way that Rav Shai is presenting the Mishkan is as a retreat. And I don't see anywhere in the text, I'm unaware of places in the text in Leviticus where it talks about engagement. To look at it through this lens, I think there's a much more optimistic way of looking at it, and it just is a little bit of a twist on Bereshit, which happened last week in Vayikra, using all of the language of Bereshit in talking about the Mishkan, that the same way that God created a paradise for people creating where they could live. People are creating this Mishkan where God can live and where we can engage with God. But no, I'm with James. I think this is a read of a reclusive, defeated religious encounter.
So this is great, as always. So let me ask about the metaphor of like a retreat center, right? You go to Isabella Friedman for a weekend, and is that inherent? If that's a fair, analogy, so is the idea that that's escapist, even if it empowers you to get back into the world, or is the point that you're making, but in Isabella Friedman, you really do commune with God and connect with things, and yet this vision of the Mishkan doesn't have that aspect?
Well, first of all, the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash following it are not temporary. And it is not when I use retreat, I use it as a verb, not as a temporary place of retreat. I mean, I wasn't going to say this, but you've invited it. It's been said that the problem with the yeshiva world is it thinks it's the world.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with this view of the Mishkan is it's saying, this is an alternative world to the world that we can't deal with.
But is it, again, I keep feeling like I have to keep apologizing for not wanting to defend Rav Shai, but the Mishkan or Beit HaMikdash is permanent, but it is not a place where almost anyone spends most of their time, right? I mean, it is a place that we go occasionally, and it functions year round, and there are people who staff it, but I don't imagine it as an alternative world that we are supposed to inhabit all the time, but it's a place that we go for an experience and then come back out.
I think you could go there for the kind of retreat experience you're talking about, but I don't think that comes from the order of the Mishkan. That comes from having, religious significance and, meeting with God. I'm not sure where that comes from, the order and the separation.
And you don't have to defend Rav Shai. He's perfectly capable of defending himself, and and it's a local call. We can even call him up.
Very
But
local.
but if it was it would be the fact that Leviticus and Deuteronomy are in this volume of the book, it would have been a much more compelling argument if he said that the connection here is really between Vayikra and Devarim being the story of how to engage with the world and how to order a society. But his hearkening back to the creation of the mythic idyllic Eden makes it feel the same way that Levinson writes about the Beit HaMikdash as being the umbilicus of the world.
Great. Okay. The challenge stands. Go to Nathan and then Lance.
So I'm not sure I'm going to make David feel better. I may make him feel worse. Rav Soloveitchik has a philosophy about an olam halacha, where the real world that he inhabits and his family inhabits, and he wishes everybody would inhabit, is the world of halacha. And the world that we actually live in was created so that we could employ the halacha in that world, but it doesn't actually. You shouldn't think about it as if it exists or has importance as a separate existence. Now, of course, that's very difficult because people actually live in the real world and they have the problems of living in the real world. But I think, philosophically, there is a link between what Shai is doing and what the Rav did.
Fascinating.
Right? I don't know if you ever thought of that when you read it.
Yeah, very interesting.
And David's going to say, "Oh, David likes it." But I would say David's going to say, and the Rav didn't live in that world either. He also had a congregation and a yeshiva, and he had and reality. As much as he gave lip service to it, and he talked about how his father couldn't countenance him looking at the sunset because the sunset's not important. What's important is Beit HaShmashas.
Right. Great. Lance, go ahead.
Okay, two things. One, behind me is a temple, and the center of that temple is not sacrifice. The center of that temple is a spring, water. And I think most people feel that there cannot be a temple without a spring like the Gihon spring. But that's not what I'm really fascinated in. I want to support Rav Shai, and I want to read to you a paragraph that I don't think you've read, but I seem to recall it's somewhere in the writing we talked about. May I?
Please.
But God's closeness has its dangers. And the Torah insists that even as God is present, God remains always transcendent. The yearning to be close to God is arguably fundamental to God-centered religion, but is also fraught with peril, since consciously or not, people all too often try to domesticate God, to reduce God to something they can comprehend, predict, and even control, lest our theology deteriorate into a cozy overfamiliarity. The Torah reminds us again and again that human temptations or illusions notwithstanding, God cannot be possessed, God cannot be manipulated. God is loving and present, but God is still God. God is still God. I am that I am. And the key here is the word manipulated. And one of the problems, there's another passage I came across this, but most people don't want to think that when they make a mishaberach, that God could care less. And unfortunately, I think the whole world spends too much time trying to manipulate God instead of relaxing and enjoying life.
Great. Back to David. Thank you.
Lance, I'm not ignoring your comment. I just didn't have enough time to take it in and think about it because I was thinking about what Nathan said. So you'll excuse me. I think, Nathan, that what the Rav wrote in Isha Halacha and also in Lonely Man of Faith was at a certain moment in time of Jewish history where the presence of the Jewish people re-entering history as a political entity was not yet certain. And I think that it is really hard for us today who think of ourselves as part of a national venture that is engaged in the world and does not retreat from the world and find our Pacific retreat. It's a more difficult concept. I wonder if the Rav would have written it the same way today, or maybe today before the most recent election, when the Jewish state is an example of chaos. But I wonder if the Rav would have written it differently with more Jewish national history behind him.
Great. All great, very generative. And we have Rav Shai to thank for that and this group to thank for that. And looking forward to carrying forward. So thanks, everybody. Love to mom and dad. Good night to all.
Thanks, Stephen.
Later, Tov.